From the simplest microorganisms to insects and humans, all living beings follow a basic rule. They're born, they grow, they age, and eventually die. This was the rule until one species decided not to follow it. And while you may expect me to be talking about some obscure microscopic bacterium or a simple fungus in the middle of the earth, it's actually just the common lobster. From birth to death, lobsters just keep growing. Their cells don't seem to age, and they keep dividing, showing little to no signs of breaking down. And you guys need to understand, this goes against fundamental laws of biology and nature itself. Every cell that's ever been made is supposed to grow old and die. How is it possible that lobsters don't age? Why is it that out of all animals, the universe decided lobsters would be the ones to live forever? And what actually happens if a lobster lives too long? In most animals, aging is built into the system. Cells divide, wear down, and eventually stop working. Muscles weaken, organs slow, and the whole machine winds down. Remember Scarface, the legendary line of the Masai Mara? In his final words, he was slow, frail, and clearly worn down. But no one who ever saw him go down like this would ever forget that he once was a beast who had taken down over 400 hyenas and killed more than 130 rival male lions. That decline, that visible weakness, that's aging. But a 90-year-old grandpa lobster could still beat a young one. What first caught scientists' attention to this trend wasn't a single lobster, but a pattern. Researchers who were studying lobsters began noticing that older lobsters didn't seem weaker than younger ones, and in fact, many older lobsters were larger, stronger, and more fertile. This obviously didn't line up with how aging normally works in literally any other animal. So naturally, scientists started asking, why aren't these lobsters slowing down? Just when they were about to lose their minds over it, it turned out lobsters produce an enzyme called telomerase. Not just when they're young, but throughout their entire lives. That's unusual. In most animals, telomerase activity shuts down in adulthood and they start aging. Let me explain in simple words. See, every time a cell divides, the tip of its DNA strands, called telomerase, gets shorter. When telomerase get too short, the cell can't divide anymore. That leads to aging, cell damage, and eventually death. Kind of like plastic tips of shoelaces. Once they wear out, everything starts to unravel. But telomerase keeps those tips intact, meaning lobster cells keep dividing cleanly and efficiently. No breakdown, no DNA fraying, no slow crawl towards cellular death. In lab tests, scientists found that lobster tissue shows little to no signs of aging, no matter how old the lobster is. That's why you'll sometimes hear people saying lobsters are immortal. They're not actually, but the phrase comes from a real idea. Their bodies don't age like ours do. Their fertility doesn't drop. Their organs don't shut down. They don't get age-related diseases the way mammals do. From a biological standpoint, they could, in theory, just keep going. They can't actually die of old age. And if you remove predators, disease, and accidents, and lobster dinners on Friday, theoretically, lobsters could actually live forever. So what exactly brings them down, if not old age? It's a little weird, but lobsters kind of cement their own fate. Lobsters have a hard outer shell called an exoskeleton. This shell protects them from predators and physical damage. But here's the catch. A lobster shell is dead. Lobsters can't grow inside it. To get bigger, they have to shed it completely in a process called molting. Molting is like taking off a tight suit and growing a new, bigger one underneath. As lobsters get older and larger, molting becomes harder and more taxing on their bodies. Their shells grow thicker, making it tougher to break free. If a lobster fails to molt properly, it can get trapped inside its old shell, leaving it weak and vulnerable to disease or predators. Plus, molting requires a huge amount of energy. But funny enough, the same molting process is also the only time lobsters can mate. During mating, the male deposits sperm into a special pouch inside the female's body, where it can be stored for months. She stays in his den for up to 2 weeks while her new shell hardens. Once her new shell hardens, she leaves, and in about 9 to 12 months, a mature female lobster can release around 100,000 eggs at once. No nest or protection, just a drifting cloud of life, most of which will disappear. Sounds like a booming start to life, right? Not exactly. Out of all of those eggs, less than 1% survive. The rest are picked up by predators, swept away by currents, or simply never make it. And from this strange and risky beginning, a rare few will grow into these crustaceans that never seem to age. A 50-year-old lobster can reach over 70 centimeters in length and weigh more than 20 pounds. That's about 600 times longer and 1,000,000 times heavier than when it was born. To understand just how crazy that is, imagine a human baby born at an average of around 20 inches and 6.6 pounds. If humans grew like lobsters, by the age of 50, you'd be almost 300 meters tall, nearly 1,000 feet, and weigh over 3,000 tons. That's heavier than a passenger jet. Keeping a body that size alive would be impossible. And strangely enough, that's exactly what happens with lobsters. At some point, their size becomes physically impossible to maintain. Molting, the process they need to grow, becomes too exhausting and risky. It's not that their bodies wear out from old age. It's that their size makes survival impossible. So, lobsters don't die because they age like most animals. They die because physics sets a limit on their incredible, never-ending growth. But that still doesn't answer the question, what happens when a lobster lives too long? Well, the answer to the question is simple and dark. For a creature as cute as the lobster, it doesn't die with a dramatic crash or some cinematic battle. What kills them is a slow, creeping failure of function. So, as I told you earlier, as lobsters keep growing, their molting cycles become longer and more infrequent. In young lobsters, molting happens several times a year, but by the time they're very old, 50, 70, even close to 100 years, it can take them years to prepare for a single molt. The energy demands skyrocket. The risk of failure grows with every attempt. Eventually, some lobsters just stop molting altogether. Not by choice, it's just that the next molt never comes. Their bodies stall at the edge of the process, too drained to go through with it. And without a fresh shell, they're stuck in a shrinking, rigid frame. They might still be alive, technically, but they can't grow, can't move properly, and become vulnerable to infection, stress, and collapse from within. Autopsies of large wild lobsters have shown evidence of shell disease, muscular deterioration, and internal organ strain, things that never show up during their prime. It's like their biology is still ready to go, but the infrastructure falls apart. And yet, they are rare outliers. The largest lobster ever recorded was caught off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada in 1977. The beast weighed 20.14 kilograms. That's 44.4 pounds and measured over 3.5 feet long. That was no lobster, honestly. It was a beast in armor with the huge claws. Scientists estimated it was at least 100 years old, though again, lobsters don't come with birth certificates, so size and shell condition were the best clues. I'm guessing it's a little hard to tell a lobster's age given they don't age, right? Anyway, what's more interesting is that it wasn't alone in the freak of nature club. Massive lobsters have been pulled up from the deep every few years, often during deep-sea trawling. These are lobsters that somehow survived decades of predator threats, disease, and increasingly impossible molts. In most cases, when lobsters reach these sizes, they're at the tipping point, one failed molt away from death. In fact, many giant lobsters show signs of serious wear, scarred shells, missing limbs, calcified joints. Some can barely move their claws. These aren't huge sea warriors. They're ancient tanks, held together by habit and luck. One of the more famous examples is George, a lobster reportedly 140 years old when it was caught near Newfoundland and briefly held in a New York seafood restaurant. After public outcry, George was released back into the ocean. But even in that case, marine biologists noted that his size and age likely meant he was nearing the natural end of the road. A creature like that can't molt again, not successfully, and without a fresh shell, it's only a matter of time. So yes, lobsters can grow massive and live over a century, but the truth is, the bigger they get, the closer they are to collapse. Their real average lifespan is actually around 31 years for males and 54 years for females. That's the quiet irony of their so-called immortality. They don't age out, they max out. Sooner or later, the system breaks because even the most remarkable creatures still live under rules. And for lobsters, the rule is simple. If you can't molt, you can't live.